But I just wanted to start by saying how much I appreciate the fact that you've all given your time to come here and help us do what I hope a ThinkIn is designed to do, which is to come to a better informed point of view. Those of you who've been before will know the way it works. Those of you who haven't, a very simple explanation. I was sat on the tube one day reading the paper, my old paper, in fact Charles' old paper too, the Times, and I was looking at the paper reading a letter on the letters page. And I remembered that when I started out editing the Times, one of the great grand predecessors, William Rees-Mogg, had said his favourite page in the newspaper was the letters page, because it had all of the expertise and eccentricity and energies of the readers. And I was reading the letters, and I remember looking across at the leader page. And to be honest with you, when I was editing the paper, my favourite thing was leader conference. I loved that half hour, sometimes a little longer, where we sat in the room and we tried to argue out what we thought on the subject of the day. And the reason I loved it most was when you try and articulate your point of view on the subject, you often discover not just what you really think, but also what you do and don't know. It finds you out. And I remember sitting, looking at the paper thinking, imagine if you could have all those people on the left-hand side, all those letter writers with all their expertise, informing the leader writers, informing that opinion. How much stronger, how much deeper that would be. And so that basically is our thinking about the thinking. It's an attempt to run, if you like, a large leader conference. So it's not a panel discussion, heaven knows we've had enough of those. It's actually intended to make sure we hear from everyone in the room. So there are some people here whose life work is saving the sea. There's some people who care about it deeply. Others who are interested in understanding how we can change what's happening in our planet. All of you, though, have an experience or an enthusiasm or an expertise that I hope you'll bring to our conversation. And so I leave you with this, our one and only rule, and even then it's not particularly well enforced, but our one rule is no questions. We don't want to have, if you like, the sages on the stage and people asking questions. We want everyone in the room to tell us what they think, tell us their personal experience, and we hope that will lead us to stories that we haven't covered, haven't been covered, and to ideas that we haven't fully thought through. So, on that note, I hand over to Giles Patel, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Right, this is housekeeping first. That there is a clock. It's a tortoise moving towards the end of the line. When it gets there, we're done. One of those here has a hard getaway time at 7:30, and maybe more than one, so we'll try to observe that, and then if people want to carry on talking afterwards, we can. These upside down white robots are cameras. These are microphones, which means we're being recorded, but we're not being broadcast. Don't be self-conscious. If you want to say something that you want to keep within these walls, then just say. But otherwise, we may record it and use it for our journalism in the future. This is intended as the first of at least 2 think-ins on saving the seas, because we think it's even more important than saving the Tory party. Briefly, can I ask the 3 of you whose faces appear up there to introduce yourselves? Who comes first? Chris.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. I'm Chris Gorrell-Barnes. I'm the co-founder of the Blue Marine Foundation. Made a movie with Charles Clover over there based on his incredible book called The End of the Line that I hope some of you have read, which we turned into a documentary. And on the back of that documentary, Charles, George and I co-founded the Blue Marine Foundation, which is set up to create marine protected areas and create new models of sustainable fishing.
Frederica.
Great. My name is Frederica Magnuson. I'm a co-founder of the Plastic Planet. My journey from making a plastic planet came from actually a movie called A Plastic Ocean. We are set up to turn off the plastic tap in food and drink, and our first ask is to have a plastic-free aisle in every supermarket.
Can everyone hear Frederica at the back? Jack? No? You might have to dial it up a little bit because you're not being amplified.
Okay.
So we'll just repeat your first ask.
My first start was a plastic ocean. I was part of that, and that's when my journey started. I co-founded a Plastic Planet with Sean Sutherland 18 months ago, and it's set up to turn off the plastic tap in food and drink specifically. We started with a plastic-free aisle, ask for every supermarket, so we can start with choice, because we believe choice and change comes together.
Thank you.
I'm Dee Kafari. I'm a round-the-world sailor, and I've sailed 6 times around the world now in various forms, forwards, backwards, with friends, on my own. Not always sad and lonely. And my most recent round the world was leading the team Turn the Tide on Plastic in the last edition of the Volvo Ocean Race. And I had a mixed gender, youth-focused team with a very clear sustainability message to address our relationship and our attitude towards single-use plastics. And for the first time ever, we did some analysis on the water content every single day where we sailed around the world, because we go to some pretty remote places. And we did a microplastic analysis. So we actually, for the first time, produced raw data of what microplastics were in the world's oceans, and that was scary.
Well, we'll find out more about that in a few minutes. I just want to reiterate what James said. Please, this is for everybody. You don't have to be an expert to speak up. All you have to have is an opinion or view. I tried to persuade my son to come tonight. He said, "What, Dad? Just to listen to you pretending to be an expert about something you don't know anything about." and he's not here. But no, I'm not an expert, but we have tried to collect a few thoughts on a slide. So, and forgive the sort of crushing of a vast subject into a few lines, and everybody who sees stuff that's missing here, tell us what we're missing. For example, the last but one item, I didn't have space to say how loud the sounds are, but I gather that some of the air pressure noises that offshore oil exploration generates can be heard by whales 2,500 miles away. So we create a heck of a din. The 0.5 ton of plastic for every cubic mile of water on the planet, I'm afraid that is a homemade calculation. You'll tell me if I'm wrong. 330 million cubic miles of water on the planet, and about 150 million tons of plastic in the water, I think. Anyway, let's just move on. We've included a picture of plastic in the ocean, not only because we have 2 people who know a lot about it, but because this, I think, sort of image defines to an extent the way the health of the ocean debate has been defined in recent years for the public. It is more complicated than that. There's a heck of a lot more to it than that. And the next one, please. This is a map of Southeast Asia, where showing places where large sea mammals and creatures have washed up recently, killed by the plastic that they've ingested. So to this extent, I'm enforcing the narrative that this is all about plastics. And can we move on? Same map, but this is to show that in the same part of the world, thanks to marine conservation, you can have nigh on miraculous results. I wrote down what his nibs David Attenborough said in his new Netflix show about the pink spot there, the Raja Ampat Marine Protected Area, where the recovery has been miraculous since it was protected in 2007, and there are 25 times more sharks there than there were. So there's hope. I wanted to inject early on the idea that there's hope, and there's another indication. There's a picture of the oceans without any plastic in, so it doesn't all have plastic in. Now, very quickly, can you raise your hand if at some point you have sat on a beach or a boat and thought, you know what, this is pretty perfect, I'm happy with this, the ocean's enormous, and I think possibly the gloom and doom is overdone. Has anybody ever thought that? Oh, we got
Maybe,
Oh.
maybe 20 years ago.
20 years ago.
Yeah, a while back.
A while back. Okay. Has anybody, by contrast, sat on a boat or a beach and thought, right, that's it? I can't stand the sight of the trash in the water, and I'm going to devote my life to doing something about it. Right, that was my segue. So, your story, Frederica, started on a beach.
Yeah.
Why plastic?
My story starts 12 years ago. I was so lucky to be able to go diving in the Philippines with my children. Then they were 9 and 11. And I remember just coming up from a dive and arriving on this tiny little island and just seeing rubbish everywhere. And my 11-year-old said, somebody's had a big picnic here. And they're like, whoa, what's happened? All these, and then we started to look, and actually all of it was household sort of food, drink, bottles, obviously. It looked like it had been a big picnic, but it actually, when we start looking at it, it wasn't from the Philippines. All this rubbish was from all over the world. And that was the moment I thought, this is really, I've been hearing all about a plastic in the oceans. I think I'm going to make a film about this. So I went back, and somebody was already in the process of making it. And I said, this is great. We're going to DNA all the plastic, and then we're going to hold people responsible.
No, what do you mean by DNA?
In the sense of saying, who is responsible for this plastic? Because it was, most of it was, I could see it was Nestle, it had a Unilever.
Okay.
I thought this would be a very easy process, and then we could all clear it up. And that's where a plastic ocean started, sort of from, and people went on to make this film. It took 8 years in the making, and it was much more complicated than I thought it would be. Sell it off and make diesel from it.
Right.
Get fishermen to pick it up and make diesel from it. But it wasn't, because what we noticed was it wasn't just a floating island, it was a smog. And as we know now, 10 years later, it's bigger than we ever thought. It's a constant smog that is all over the ocean.
A smog of plastic.
Yeah, it's
Right.
a smog of plastic.
Oh, okay. Now, be honest. In that sort of 8 years of self-education, do you think that the public has alighted on plastic because it's easy to alight on and we all use it every day, or because it is actually the principal problem?
I think it is, when you think, the principal problem I think about when we look at the seas and the problems with the seas is, the warming, global warming. And I think plastic represents the top of it. Where does plastic come from is fossil fuels. And when you look at what the problem about emissions and CO2 is fossil fuels too. So it has a sort of, I think it's something that the public, we feel that we are offending every day. We are part of the problem because we buy things in plastic that we don't want it to be in plastic. So if you think about, if we have just been using plastic as a default material for everything, from sort of wrapping perishable goods in to making wonderful things that we need to be plastic. So I think last 50 years we have just become addicted to this wonderful material that is so indestructible.
Right. Chris,
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of steal your line, right? You want to move the conversation on beyond
Yeah.
plastic. Why?
I think plastic has actually acted as a very good marketing tool to marine conservation, because before the plastic euphoria, before Blue Planet 2 and before everybody saw dead whales and plastic everywhere, nobody really cared about protecting the ocean. The ocean was out of sight, out of mind. So I think it has acted as a good marketing tool. I think that what we now need to think about is a healthy ocean one with no plastic in it? No, it's not. A healthy ocean is one that is full of fish, full of fauna and flora, has healthy coral, doesn't have agricultural runoff, and is able to function. Because You know, if the ocean doesn't function, we can't function. You know, it is effectively the life support system. You know, and I do this often. If I ask everybody here just to take 2 deep breaths.
Let's do it.
Even in polluted, ultra-low emission zone of London that launched today, you know, every second breath that we take does come from the ocean because it produces half of the oxygen that we breathe, and it also absorbs nearly half of the carbon that we produce. So we need it to function. In order for it to function, we need to protect it, and we also need to then restore it. So yes, we need to deal with plastic, and we need to stop the plastic getting in the ocean. Plastics crisis, in my opinion, is a land-based problem. You know, we've got 10 rivers. Africa and Asia are the biggest culprits that are responsible for nearly about 60% of the plastics getting into the oceans. We need to change human behaviour and the way that we respect and deal with plastics, and we need better recycling, we need better system, we need circular economy. But we need to stop the plastic getting in the ocean. What we need to do is we need to protect the ocean. So we need to create marine protected areas because, as you said in slide number 3 there, when you do protect areas of the ocean has an amazing propensity to come back to life. So you stop taking all the great stuff out of it and it does come back to life. But not only do we need to protect it, we need to restore it. So we need to bring these ecosystems back to life. So we need to try and protect the coral, we need to try and plant mangroves, we need to protect seagrass, because when you have these wonderful plants, mangroves and seagrass within the ocean, then the ocean is much more powerful and it has a much better ability to do its job, which is to, you know, produce oxygen, absorb carbon and to function. So I think we need to move the conversation on. We need to stop plastic, but we need to think about the ocean as an ecosystem that needs protecting and restoring very, very quickly because we're running out of time.
Great. Dee, in a second, I want to hear about what you've seen in the open ocean where almost nobody else has been. But first, just to get a sense of the level of dismay or optimism in the room. I mean, before we started, Chris was saying you were reading The Indestructible Earth, a profoundly...
Uninhabitable Earth.
I'm sorry. I wish it were indestructible.
Has anyone read it?
Apparently really depressing, but essential reading. But just a show of hands, or even some words to indicate whether you think, as I think his name was Stephen Emmett, who wrote 10 Billion, whether you think we are, or whether we can save the seas. Who broadly speaking, from what you've absorbed about the state of the blue part of the planet, thinks we've gone beyond the point of no return? Can you just sort of say why and tell me what your name is?
Emily, and I think you'll probably guess why by my accent.
Okay.
I think the Great Barrier Reef is pretty horrible in its position right now, for sure.
Uh-huh. Have you been there?
Yes.
You snorkeled around there?
I've also scuba dived.
Okay, so what do you see, or maybe it's not visible? What are the...
Well, it's almost what we were talking about before, about that very complex mix of runoff, coral bleaching, the temperature rising, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So I guess it's such a complex problem, I feel hopeless about it. And it's so far gone in that area.
Do you think this side of the world we're deluding ourselves? If you know, we have a nice evening chat about marine conservation areas and...
I think people are deluding themselves about it in Australia too. It's not this side of the world, I think it's everywhere. Because, the government's allowing oil rigs to be built.
On the east coast
on
there?
Parts of the reef, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing? I actually went to a talk about it, and it was all about science and also obviously social change for the reef, Great Barrier Reef. And what's interesting is they're introducing new kind of corals who can take, because it's the heating of the waters. So the corals are being bleached because of the heating. So they're introducing new kind of coral to this area, and they've been very successful for it. And I'm obviously there was a very depressing night because you just saw these black strips of 80% is gone.
Yeah.
but there was some kind of hope in science and bringing new spawn to the parts of the reef and introducing new kinds of reefs.
But what's new about them?
But it's basically reefs that can take the
Is
heat.
it genetically
They're
modified?
probably faster growing too.
Yeah,
I
they're
guess the
faster
other
growing,
hopeless
yes.
thing is It's a bit like moss. It just doesn't grow very quickly.
No.
You know, like it takes hundreds of years for that reef to form.
Yeah.
So my kids won't ever see the Great Barrier Reef that I saw when I was 15.
Okay.
I think I think we have to be hopeful, and that there are some fantastic success stories when you have protected large areas of the ocean and it comes back to life. So
Yeah.
there is an opportunity. We know what we need to do, and we just need to do it much faster, much harder, with a lot more money and government support.
I want to get onto that when the tortoise, whose name is Agatha, by the way, gets to roughly the halfway point. Solutions, yeah, we're all about solutions. There was another hand up, someone who was depressed. Yes. Can you tell us your name?
Well, I'm Seb. I'm depressed.
You're Seb and you're depressed.
My name is Seb, and
Okay, great.
I'm gloomy about the prospects for our planet generally, particularly the oceans. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, large parts of the Great Barrier Reef are protected, and the issue is the carbonisation of the water. So it's not just about protecting and allowing places to recover. It's actually the entire ocean is becoming weak carbonic acid, which makes it much more difficult for coral to reform, as based on calcium carbonate. So it's not just about protecting areas. I mean, that's part of the solution ultimately, but it's so much bigger than that. And I agree we have to have hope, otherwise what's the point?
Can I ask a personal question? Are you a scientist?
I'm an investor actually, but I did science.
Science background.
Yeah.
Because, in deference to my son, I'm very wary, and I think it's seriously an important thing for us all to bear in mind, especially because of some people in the audience, that we don't conflate sort of campaigning language and ideas with science, especially when the two diverge. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say that...
Sorry, remind me of your name.
Cleverer, from the Blue Marine Foundation, and I used to work with Sarah, which is why I tried to interrupt. But I was just going to say, yes, of course it's true that acidification and warming are destroying a lot of coral, which is a crucial habitat for so much of our marine life, a sort of disproportionate amount of marine life. But importantly, reefs that are overfished and stripped of all their life and ecosystems are much more vulnerable to that. So when we're trying to discern which is the more important of all the dreadful things that we're doing to the ocean, all the bad stuff we're putting in and all the stuff we're taking out, it all kind of each problem informs the other problems.
Right.
And overfishing over extraction and habitat destruction is kind of at the heart of it, because if you strip the oceans of their life, then they become much less resilient to the other problems that we're talking about.
Let's make sure we talk more about that, because that was news to me until I was watching Attenborough on coastal waters this afternoon, that you can make a reef more resilient if you keep it as a habitat. But first, let's head out into the open ocean. I'm fascinated by the idea that 1,000 miles from human habitation, you can see a plastic bag. Is that true?
It gets even worse. You can see helium balloons. They're my new bugbear. I am the real party pooper now. Literally in the middle of oceans, you see the fishing nets, the bottles, the food packaging, helium balloons, as I say. And I'm just waiting for one of them to have someone's name on it. And I was going to name that child that had that balloon. Crates, buckets. It's unbelievable what you do see. And I wondered if my conscience was just more alert, because I was fronting up a project, Turn the Tide on Plastic. This was my 6th time around the world. Am I looking for it? But my crew were out there doing this for the very first time, and they were noticing. And I was thinking, okay, so this is an issue that has progressively got worse over the 10 years I've been sailing around the world. And I think we compounded that with the fact that we were doing the microplastics, so the bits you can't see, that are in suspension in the ocean. So we were taking it from about a metre under the water, and it was running through several filters. They'd end up going back to the lab in Germany at the end of each leg. And originally, they didn't even have the technology to count the microplastics. Poor lab technician was literally there with the microscope doing it. This developed, and we have a place in the Southern Ocean, the most remote place in the ocean is called Point Nemo, thousands of miles from human life. The closest person to you is whoever's in the International Space Station at the time.
So it's just a map reference?
It's just literally a reference in the Southern Ocean, South Pacific, and you're there and our data reading had microplastics present, and you're thinking, oh my God, this problem is so much worse than we thought it was. And at the same time in this research, as a race around the world, we deploy drifter buoys for NOAA, so the weather research organisation in America. And it was kind of counterproductive for me to be throwing this product into the ocean, given that I was, there looking after our oceans, commenting on how much rubbish is in the ocean. And they didn't really give me a very clear answer of what happens to these drifter buoys in 300 days' time when they stop working. But from the minute they're deployed, they start transmitting data to Florida, and they start getting all this data. So they're now understanding ocean currents and drift patterns, temperatures and things like that. And finally, we got collaboration. People were talking to each other. And this is, I think, the biggest step forwards we can make is have some joined up thinking. And they were understanding these macroplastics that we could easily see travelling in our ocean's currents. And over time, through sun and degradation, they're breaking down into the microplastics, becoming in suspension, getting confused for food, and entering the food chain. And that, to me, was the light bulb in this project, that as soon as you make it personal, people get on board with it. And I think this is the whole thing of education, education, education. Because as Claire said, all these different things that we're doing to our planets kind of all overlap each other, and they're all just as bad. And when you suddenly, in the previous times, it was someone else's beach, someone else's river, someone else's ocean, someone else's problem. Norway do a beach clean and they phone up the UK because they're picking up all our rubbish. And then you go to somewhere else and they go, oh, it's those bloody cruise liners. And everyone's got a very easy blame culture, but actually it's everyone's problem. And now we've started to realise that this is everyone's problem from their everyday actions. And as soon as you put it in the food chain, suddenly Johnny's little fish and chips on a Friday night is now threatened. And they start to understand that it affects them. And I think that's the way people have got on board with the plastic scenario. And I think we talk about ocean acidification and the other issues, but people don't really understand it. It's that ocean that's out there that I never go to. I'm an island nation, but I've never been to the seaside and I never go in the sea, so it's not my problem. And so for me, I would say my takeaway at the moment is we need to explain it on a scale that relates to people. So for me, I had a sporting platform as a sailor where I could talk about the science I was doing. And the scientists behind it were just ecstatic, because generally we learn in the presentations that we did that scientists are very good at talking to scientists, but they're not very good at talking to the general public. And when you get an inspirational athlete or a sports person kind of giving that message in normal language, suddenly all their fans and followers are taking it on, and suddenly everyone's swapped their plastic bottle for a refillable bottle and they all feel good about themselves. And the power of a sporting platform was unbelievable.
But you also said that when you got off the boat, you felt that you'd stepped out of a bubble where people were taking it seriously back into the real world where nobody was. Was that a horrible letdown?
It was. I came back, we finished July, and somebody posted a photo of Wimbledon. So I'd just been part of the Volvo Ocean Race, a huge round-the-world event where we had lived and breathed and everything on this sustainable project, this momentum we were getting. Anybody that sold anything in the race village had to be compostable, biodegradable. There wasn't a single plastic bottle sold. There was water stations everywhere for refillable bottles, and they would sell them. So literally everything was checked. You weren't allowed cable ties. You had to use Velcro. Your packaging was checked. It was like the environmental police were on your case the whole time, but it became the norm. And I came back and someone posted me a picture at Wimbledon saying, look, paper straws in the plastic cup with the plastic lid. And I was like, you're kind of missing the point there. And even the players then were commenting on the amount of water bottles, because they're sponsored by Evian, were around the courts and stuff, and I suddenly realised that my world that I'd lived in hadn't grown as big as I thought, and we still have so much further to go. And that's a whole education thing.
Well, Barney, can we go back to the list of problems? Because we've been pretty practical so far, talking about... So the bottom one, I'm sorry that this is such a catch-all, us, right? What do people feel if we think about this much more generally, philosophically, if you like? It's clearly about more than plastic. Plastic is a problem because of the way we live. And this comes back to the question of whether we are, I'll use the word screwed because I think it's a little more acceptable on tape. Is it ultimately a massive job of re-engineering the way we live, and are the oceans screwed unless we can do that? Yeah.
Sorry, it's David. I don't think with...
David, I recognise your face. You were in the Navy. Is that right?
No.
No. I don't recognise your face, I'm sorry.
It's a whole other story. I'm worried by who I look at.
Well, now I'm looking around the room for the other David. Sorry, go on.
I think we've been talking about the sea and we've been talking about plastics. The last point is quite interesting because it's the whole circularity. As despoiling the land is leading to, or the scientists would say, leading to climate change. So deforestation, which itself creates flow of, it's deforesting areas for agriculture. Agriculture results in chemicals onto the land. The land is leached and the water then goes into the sea or the rivers more quickly. So you've got the whole circularity of what's going on. And it's serving us because it's growing our avocados or whatever that we want to be.
And I was looking for an answer to this, didn't find it. What is the worst aspect of runoff? If we were to focus on runoff, where in the world and what in the world is, can anyone help me here, is the most fixable problem?
Is it not the 7 estuaries you talked about earlier? I mean, you were saying about
I think from the
there are these 7 entry points, and there's 60% of everything that goes into the ocean.
I think from the runoff of plastic waste is the 10 rivers. I think there's 7 in Asia and 3 in Africa. But I think the worst culprit is mass agriculture, dairy farming, ranching, which is not only cutting down the forest, but is producing a huge amount of waste and using a huge amount of water that is then running off into the oceans.
Contaminated water. So which oceans? Are we talking the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico? I should know. Who's the expert? Yes, Charles. This is Charles.
Hi. Here's another one from the Blue Marine Foundation. I think there are very big problems that we don't have. It's very difficult to empathise with them, and they are dead zones which are created at the bottom of the sea by agricultural runoff of various kinds, nutrients and so on, which over-enrich the seabed to the extent that other things cannot grow. There are all sorts of other things. I think that with pollution, it is not a global problem in anything other than the overall over-acidification and by fossil fuels. It is a localised problem. And actually what is killing things in one place isn't the thing that's killing things in another. I went to see the Maldivian Environment Minister and he said, well, what are your big problems? He said, number 1, waste. He said, oh yeah, and probably you're on the same sort of bandwagon as everybody else, plastics and stuff. We totally understand that. No, he said, no, human sewage. That's what's killing our reefs. And of course, he's completely right. So, when you start talking about pollution, it's quite a complicated thing. I think the thing that's interesting about plastics is that it is a global problem, and these global problems are quite recent in our civilization. I mean, I think Thor Heyerdahl actually spotted plastics floating around in the middle of the ocean in the 50s, and we didn't do anything about it. But they are relatively recent. We didn't know about climate change in the EU. Arrhenius, late 19th century, thought people thought it was fascinating. 1990s, ION, IPCC Working Group 1. Big problem. Acidification, maybe 10 years later, right? So remember, people got worried about it since 10 years ago. These are very, very recent for our civilization. Some of them are global and some of them are local. And the global ones are easier to get people worked up about, but harder to solve. That's the paradox.
I was just going to say, I mean, if we think about sort of, plastic, everybody says, oh, we know about the plastic problem. But do we really know about the plastic problem? Us humans who use 2 million bags a minute, we are forecast to, to double, it's not slowing down when you look at the numbers. Unilever sells their single-use sachets to the developing countries like the Philippines, like Indonesia. How many do they sell a year? 57 billion a year. I mean, for me, from my point of view, it's not slowing down. We say we have a problem. It's like an addict. Us at a Plastic Planet, we always say, I'm a plastic addict, but I'm ready for change, because nothing seems to be slowing down. So we talk about plastic in a sense like we all know now that, but we continuing sending our waste abroad. I mean, since the China ban, the UK, in the name of recycling, has been sending it abroad. We can't send it to China anymore. We're now sending it to places like Myanmar, Indonesia, and Turkey is at the moment taking most of it. So, we at Plastic Planet actually put EDM, early day motion, through Parliament. It's going through the end of this month to stop sending our waste abroad to developing countries.
I wanted to ask about that. Do we have any more influence over recycled plastic and what happens to it in the end, given that it's now going to Turkey and Myanmar and Indonesia, than we did in China?
No. The problem is we have a broken waste management system. So we are not recycling. We don't, it's only 9% is recycled. So 91% is not recycled. So it's either burnt or it's going to landfill. So at the moment, we are not dealing with we have to start dealing with our own waste. And so when people say, 8 million tons are dumped in the ocean every year, part of it is from that.
Thank you. We'll come to you in a second. And you, but just in the blue scarf. What's your name?
My name's Bex. I work for the Wildlife Trusts.
Which trust?
The Wildlife Trusts,
based
up in Yorkshire. So obviously plastic pollution is a huge issue that we do need to tackle, but I think it's really important to say that we just simply cannot recycle our way out of this problem. We don't talk about reduction. You hear about companies sponsoring corporate beach cleans or, helping find recycling solutions, but that's not the solution. It's part of the solution, and we definitely need to create a circular economy, but we simply need to reduce how much we produce. Which links onto my main point, which I think is about the fact that while we need to tackle plastic pollution, absolutely, the problem is cultural as much as it is anything else. The reason we have this problem is because it's a single-use culture. It's not about single-use plastics, it's single-use per se. So we can get rid of single-use plastic straws and stirrers and cups, but what will happen? Business will just fill the gap with another product that puts pressure on another resource. So we won't have single-use plastic straws, but we'll have paper ones. So then that creates further problems in terms of land use, management, etc., etc. So I think that one of the problems that we are really facing is culture, that we think it's okay to just use something once and throw it away, regardless of what it's made of.
Yeah.
And that is the huge challenge that we face.
I agree. We're starting to see some very promising moves in the fashion industry, which has been forever fashion, that you're starting to see reusable, recyclable, new rental platforms coming out in the fashion industry, and you've got great organisations like Kering, which are now doing very well because they're really focusing on sustainable use of fashion. I think you now need to move that into all other areas of society.
I certainly reduce my trousers. Katie, yes.
I just wanted to pick up on your cultural point, because actually I think that actually in this society today we actually reward people for recycling. So actually the sort of you think you're doing the right thing by recycling, and actually if you sort of set your whole society up to recycle, what you're saying is it's okay to use plastic as long as you recycle it, rather than if you set it up for multi-use rather than single use. So I was just going to echo that point, that I think that the issue is a broad one around what we reward and what behaviour we want from people. And I think I do the right thing if I recycle. Actually, I'd be better off not using it in the first place. Right. But everything is set up to recycle.
We'll come to you at the back. Yes.
Thanks.
Sorry, what's your name?
Yeah, Julian Kirby. I'm Friends of the Earth's plastic pollution campaigner. So going back to your us point at the bottom, I think in the respect of which we're in a really, really terrible situation, much worse than we realise, and there's so many different ways we can illustrate that. One is the IPCC report, the UN government body on climate, saying that we've got 12 years to turn around climate change to keep within 1.5 degrees, at which point we'll only lose 90% of the world's coral reefs.
Right.
And actually the IPCC is, there's a huge shitfight, pardon my French there, but before they've even published, you've got fossil fuel producing countries who are there influencing what they come up with. If you want to know how bad it really is, then follow the climate scientists, and they'll scare the pants off you. But to turn it around to the other page, because I think there is hope. I think it probably gets worse before it gets better. And plastic is really, I've worked on environment stuff for a while. I've never seen anything like the level of public response to any environmental issue. And we can get into the psychology of that. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it's just a tangible thing. You can see it and feel it, and then we even write songs, the Kinks, Plastic Man, that is something that we can easily sort of demean it. So people have connected with that. Now, if we're going to deal with plastic pollution properly, and I think this is where it really gets interesting, we are at a bit of a sort of a crossroads here, then we have to do it in a way that doesn't say we can carry on recycling and we can just substitute one material to another, or plastic for something that looks like plastic but it isn't, because then we just carry on with the worst problem. The way to deal with it properly, and this is the debate we need to shape, is to say, well, we need to switch away from throwaway single use altogether. And we've got really interesting stuff happening with reuse culture and business models developing. So that's where we are right now.
Thanks. Gentleman in the white shirt, and then we'll come to you. Thanks.
I think I should disclose an interest.
Yeah. His name is Matthew, he's my brother.
Yeah, in But I'm struck by how many of the problems we're discussing here are one way or another tragedies of the commons, and the ocean is the biggest commons that we have, but all of these seem to be commons. And it's the difference between the people who are suffering the problems and the people who are perpetrating the crimes. And it's about ownership. So in terms of looking towards solutions, one of the things that I found really quite exciting was the Walker's Crisps issue, which just forced the problem back to where it came from. And it was nice and rebellious.
How did that happen?
Because Walker's Crisps packets have the address on them, so you could literally just put them in a...
But sorry, was there an actual campaign?
Yeah,
sorry, I work for, and this is a social, probably get me.
So who speak up?
I work for
Sorry,
a PR company.
we can't hear you, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, so I'm probably going to get a few emails from people in here, but I work for a PR company, and one of our
What's your name?
Is PepsiCo. Feel them. But this isn't somebody that I worked for, but I was in the office when this was happening, and PepsiCo were really it hit the fan in that company when that campaign started, and it was actually deadly effective to get them to listen. You're absolutely right, because when suddenly you have every national newspaper covering this story, and then what happens is the campaign picks up and thousands of people were sending crisp packets back to workers. That's when executives sit up and listen. So when it goes back to kind of getting corporate entities to take notice of that kind of stuff, those kind of campaigns are really effective.
So is this the exception that proves the rule of the tragedy of the commons?
Well, no, it's just it links back the problem with the people. So
right.
Looking for solutions where the cost of dealing with it gets forced back, and it will need to be forced, it'll be regulation. But requiring McDonald's to pick up every single piece of trash on our roadsides. That sort of thing, where it's identifiably coming. You were talking about the beaches and being able to DNA it back to Unilever or whatever. That ownership of the problem needs to get back to the corporate sector that produces it.
Thanks. Yes,
I was actually going to go to that point of...
What's your name?
My name's Connie, I work for Seahorse Environmental Communications. And the government is currently looking at what is extended producer responsibility, which is basically finding a way of making companies pay or be to some degree responsible for how the end product is disposed of. But things are still really, really slow. It's sort of moving one step at a time by a million consultations. But I was going to say this is where I would think we should really be putting the pressure on government actually, in sort of starting to regulate companies and starting to make that sort of transition into an actual circular economy.
Not only because you're pinning the blame where it needs to be blamed, but because to an extent you're pushing at an open door.
Well,
I mean, the players are willing to step up.
Well, they kind of have to because they're under the spotlight. So the recent inquiry into the fashion industry, for example, wasn't done by government but by parliamentary committee. And they made recommendations that basically fast fashion producers should pay, I think it was an absolutely minuscule percentage of what it costs to recycle or reuse the materials that they waste or that they produce. And it's that kind of thing that I think would be good, but if you were doing it in a way that actually meant something to companies, because if you're asking them to, every 2p out of every garment goes, you have to spend an extra 2p on the cost of a garment to then reuse it or recycle it, that doesn't send the message to companies. Okay. It has to be more than that, and it has to be a significant amount.
Can I just
yes, and then we'll come to you.
One thing that I'd love to, the Tortoise is running out, to steer the conversation a little bit back to saving the sea, not about disposable plastic. And
yeah.
We've got to talk about IUU fishing. We've got to talk about the high seas. We've got to talk about
You're absolutely
government's
right.
promise of protecting the ocean.
And in fact, let's have the next slide. Did we have this one already? I don't think so. So this is just. I got hooked on seas, right? That's the only reason it's all seas. But this was my attempt at dragging all the possible solutions into one place. But let's talk about solutions while we've still got some tortoise time. Number 2 is a really fascinating human story, isn't it? Boyan Slat is the young Dutchman who has headed out under the Golden Gate Bridge to scoop up the North Pacific gyre and has failed at the first attempt. I mean, I don't think he even got there, right?
No.
But
I just want to go back to Chris's point in the sense of what is the biggest thing that's facing our seas is overfishing. I'm just trying to say, like, if we're here to talk about the seas, and I think we've hijacked it with plastic because it's something that is so emotional,
Right.
Emotional, and we see the plastic in the sea. We're here to talk about the sea, so I think it'd be quite interesting just to know about what's happening with the overfishing and heating of the seas. That's the sort of things that's really challenging our seas at the moment. And could we have some stats on the overfishing?
Well, Blue Marine's own line is that 90% of global fish stocks are fully or overexploited. Is that right?
I think back to, there's a couple of points. Back to the cultural point, it's becoming unacceptable now to use single-use plastic, and everybody has their reusable coffee cup. It's great, but how many people in the room here are eating fish that's been stolen from somebody else, or eating fish that is as endangered as a white rhinoceros? Everybody, people going and eating bluefin tuna at Nobu, not thinking about where it comes from, and I think something like 50% of fish in every restaurant on a plate is stolen from somewhere else. So culturally, we need to think about what we're eating and where it comes from, even as well as actually what you're putting in yourself, bin on plastic. But I think looking at, it's very important to think about illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. This is a $20 billion a year criminal empire that is literally sort of roving pirates that are destroying the ocean, that are stealing fish from the poorest people on the planet, bringing it back and selling it to Westerners. And this There's subsidies that are going into these into illegal fishing. That this really needs to be addressed if we're going to stop overfishing.
Well, I want to ask how we police that, and I know that one of the things that you've done is help create vast protected areas, but how on earth do you police them? But first, yes, I did say we'd come to you.
No, it's a point. It's on overfishing, and because I wanted to bring back the conversation as well.
What's your name?
Fernando. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm more on the optimistic side of the room. I think I've seen a lot of business models today, and it comes from like the left field in a sense. I'm seeing a lot of investments in cellular agriculture and lab-grown meat and things like that.
Sorry, investments in what type of agriculture?
Cellular agriculture,
yeah. Right.
Lab-grown meat, and synthetic biology just in general. And it's not a short-term solution, it's more on a 10-year, 8-year horizon, but it addresses a whole bunch of the points that we bring up in terms of agriculture, runoff, waste, and things like that, that if you can grow a fish in a lab, then you're not taking it from the ocean. And it will happen. It's just a matter of when and how much money it takes to get there. But
there's a brilliant company called Finless Foods in San Francisco that
But it raises an interesting general point. I mean, you, madam, said earlier on we can't recycle our way out of this. Can we tech our way out of it, or is that a delusion too?
I think that technology obviously offers some of the solutions to us. We have the solutions to most of the problems that we're facing. We simply need the political will to put the solutions in place. I think we have this huge potential for technology to solve the problems in terms of enforcement, exactly what you're talking about. We've got huge amounts of illegal fishing going on, which comes with other problems aside overfishing, like slavery and terrible conditions and all the rest of the awful things happening at sea. But we can absolutely use technology to better effect in terms of regulating illegal fishing and other activities. And if we're going to realise this recent call to protect 30% of the high seas, there's a recent report that's come out suggesting areas that we can protect. We will absolutely need to use that technology to police, that kind of area of our oceans. It just can't be done.
Sasha, I'll come to you in a second. Just behind you, yeah.
I just wanted to. It was interesting because when we were talking.
Sorry, what's your name?
Frank Vilsco. We were talking earlier, and you made a very good point about the fact the plastics issue captured everyone's imagination, and it was partly because it was personal. It was personal because some of the images were very tactile, but also something you could understand how you could make a change in a very small way. But also, I think that personal story, the media have understood personal communication for a long time now, and they know, when there's a major disaster in the human world, like an earthquake, it's much more effective to report a child, an individual child perhaps, who's got a particularly sad story, and that can capture people's imagination. But if you just say 10 million people have died, people just white it out. And I think these global problems suffer from that very particularly. And I think actually what's happened in the room today is quite interesting, because you wanted to bring it back to the whole topic of the oceans. But actually we're falling into the same trap, that if we try and talk about the entire ocean problem in this room, it's too big for us to grapple with. We can break it down, and we can actually say there are 6 different problems, and there are 6 different forums, and there are 6 different action groups, and they're all going to play a part. And actually saying which one's the most important is not helpful, because it actually, you can't do the whole oceans, because everybody just gets, and I'm finding myself hearing so much stuff today that I'm kind of going over, well, this is too big of a problem, I can't think about it anymore. But breaking it down is very good about the personal. And as one example though, to your point about the overfishing, we just need to tell people the fish they're eating is full of tiny bits of plastic. So they stop eating it. And then there's a little simple thing that everybody stops eating fish because it's horrible. And maybe people will become vegetarians instead.
Plastics crisis will cure over.
Perhaps sometimes the solutions can be strange places.
Sasha.
Well, my point follows on very nicely from that, which is that my head is now spinning, and when I was asked to be an expert, there are so many experts on the issue, and every time I'm in a room with people doing amazing things, my head just gets in a whole mess about what the problem is and what the solution is. There are so many sort of facets to it. But one thing that struck me as the conversation here evolved was what Tortoise can do that others don't do, because every media organisation has an agenda, and the thing about Tortoise so far from my reading of it is that there isn't really an agenda. And what I would love to see is a campaign or an initiative or a journalistic endeavour where there's a step back, and it's not about plastics or MPAs, or it's taking a historical view of what maybe has worked in the past, where there's a natural phenomena, maybe it's smoking, maybe it's petrol, maybe God knows what, but actually what has worked over the last 100 years, 200 years, and how can that be applied? And maybe it is that point. I was thinking it must be global, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's the sort of Barack Obama effect of local communities everywhere coming together, and that's where impact is made. But it's very hard to get that feeling every time you open the door to this issue.
Yeah. Well, we were thinking about what pressure points there might be to get results, specific results with this vast and sometimes amorphous subject. Can we have a last slide very quickly? So here are some people who know more about the problem in a sense than many others. We had an amazing stat about 54 billion single-use sachets, but you also said that that Unilever is trying to work on it,
yes.
Right? I'd be interested to know. Let's just take this as a generic point. But there are individuals out there who could be lent on. Has anyone had any success, or is anyone optimistic about the strategy of leaning on individuals, bringing pressure to bear? Fernando. And behind, we haven't heard from you. Yes.
Me.
Yeah.
Hi.
What's your name?
Kimvara.
Say again.
Kimvara. Sorry, it's a difficult name. I have kind of two things. One thing that I just wanted to highlight in case there was enough time is that next year, 2020, is a huge year politically because there are so many events happening. The first Treaty of the High Seas is happening, and I think it's a really unique opportunity for people who don't really know that some of these huge events are happening. And I think there's lots of things that maybe Tortoise could do to highlight that these, like COP is happening, which is an environmental organisation where there's the huge meeting that's happening, and I do a lot of work on the global goals, and most of which you might not know. Sorry if you don't know.
Go on, tell us.
So they're basically just 17 goals that were signed in September of 2015. Every country in the world has signed on to them, and they're a plan to last from 2015 to 2030. But lots of the environmental goals have, there's a goal of 14 and 15, and they run out in 2020, so next year. The targets that were set by all the governments run out next year. So there's an opportunity to really grab like a new deal for nature, and I think that talking about what the opportunities that there are for your voices to be heard next year is really, really important as well.
Thanks. James.
I just want to go back to the point about that Frank made about having different sort of lanes that you can run in, because I share Sasha's point. I think like, good grief, we're just overwhelmed by things. I wanted to go back to overfishing and sort of Chagos Islands and marine reserves. So I think it'd be quite helpful if we could give people a sense of agency in this rather than just feeling powerless about it. And part of that is I take Sasha's point that some of it might be really local and communal. But this issue about marine reserves, what I don't know is what are we aiming for? Like, what's the number? So if in the previous slide, Giles, I think it said 7% of the world, right? I used to work in the US. One of the most popular federal interventions was Teddy Roosevelt's intervention on national parks. Right? National parks in the US account for, I think, 14% of the overall land of the United States. What are we aiming for? Are we aiming for 14% of the sea?
What are we aiming for? Love the global goals. Massive fan. Everyone should know about the global goals. 14, I think, is obviously the most important because to protect the ocean. But in terms of marine protected areas, so most countries signed up to 10% by 2020. At the moment, we're about between 5.6 and 6% globally. Is that right? 7.4%. we need to get to 30% by 2030. So if we protect 30...
How do you do this? I mean, you're going to have to just buy chunks of ocean?
So what you want... The most important water to protect is territorial water, because that has the richest biodiversity and the most fish stocks, and so therefore in countries' jurisdiction. So getting countries to actually move with what they've promised to protect 30% of their territorial waters. So some countries are doing well. Chile, Belize just got to 10%. The UK, with Michael Gove, back to your point, are any individuals doing anything great? The environmental minister and this government signed up to back the Blue Belt, which is turning all of the British overseas territories, Chagos being one of them, into marine protected areas. So the UK will now get to 30%.
It's 32.
It's 32%. It's 32%.
If it does the whole Ascension.
If it protects the whole of Ascension, which is what Blue's been working on tirelessly for the last 4 years. So it's possible, and if we do get to 30%, the ocean has, it's got an amazing propensity to recover. So if we do get to 30%, there is a chance that the ocean can, big areas of it can recover, which then the fish comes back to life, and then the ecosystems can be restored.
Okay, we're actually technically at the end, and I know, Chris, if you have to skedaddle. Let's just try and get 3 more people in. I want to hear what you have to say about solutions in a second, but the gentleman in the white shirt and here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Johan. I'm selling boring software to companies. So, I was
boring or Boeing?
Boring. I'm not qualified in C or anything, but a lot of passion. I really appreciate that. I am annoyed to see plastics in the street, the same way I'm annoyed to see it in the ocean. Yes, it's very visual. We see plastic. It's disturbing. But we talk about the Great Barrier Reef. Yes, I've seen it myself. It's great. But that's also a visual. But that's a luxury. That's a problem for people like us, rich people living in rich countries. But are we teaching our kids about protecting the environment? We always blame the politician, but are we doing the job ourselves? Yes, we should not eat fishes because we are overfishing. Are we asking ourselves about eating less meat so we put less of these dirty things in the sea coming from the river? What about the impact of the glaciers and the icebergs melting into the sea? What is the impact of that new source of water coming into the ocean? So a lot of different questions. I think the fact is we have too many people on this planet, and more, and it's not going to go down, it's going to go up. I don't want to be pessimistic, but the companies and the governments are only going to change if we change our own behavior, and that starts from today and from now. That's more a statement than a question.
Yes.
I think my point is that it's only going to change.
Sorry, what's your name?
Oh, sorry, Alice. It's only going to change. My view is it's only going to change when the local tourist economies are impacted. So the seas get so bad that less people go there to dive, less people go there to swim with turtles, less people go there to, take Instagram photos. Like, I know that sounds quite cynical, but whenever I go on holiday anywhere, I look around and there's like the Sri Lankan fishermen who are basically completely dependent on blue whales passing by and hundreds of people going out to see them, or people in Barbados who feed turtles and think that that's okay and are dependent on hundreds of people paying money to go on a catamaran and get drunk and see the turtles. When you think about these things and the way these people's livelihoods are completely dependent on us going to enjoy the ocean, when I think if the ocean becomes less enjoyable, interesting, Instagram worthy and nice to be in or nice to look at, will that actually be the point at which we start to change, or they help us, or they help lobby the governments to actually start to change the way that they deal with waste in their country or the way that they treat animals in their oceans or whatever. So I sort of take an even more cynical view that it's more of an economic thing and that humans are only really good at stopping things when it becomes not economically viable to continue doing them, if you look at the way that history has gone.
But is there is the Sri Lankan example, for example, one of where the economy has been impacted, or are the blue whales still there?
So they're still there, but I think they're massively sort of abusing the fact that they're there at the moment. If you go there, there's about 50 plus operators all chasing after these poor blue whales who are just trying to migrate and hang out with their offspring. And what you notice is a huge economy is just like Sri Lanka's now. You can actually go,
I think the money has been very late into the realisation of the enormity of the ocean economy. So if you look at the ocean economy, it's worth roughly $3 trillion a year, and that is from tourism, fishing, blue carbon, and this was the first year in Davos where the money goes to talk about where there was a specific ocean day, and there's now the investment community, both venture philanthropy, social impact, and real money circling the ocean about how can investment and economic models be used to actually to bring this economy back to life, but ensure to restore it.
And I guess my point is just that we are so badly educated about how to treat the ocean. We're mistreating it everywhere, and people don't even realise it's mistreatment. But that in itself is really bad.
And that requires education and understanding that the ocean is effectively the life support system of our planet, right? At the moment, it's out of sight, out of mind. And my point at the beginning was what it actually does in order to allow us to function. People need to know about that. When they realise that, then hopefully that they'll want to protect it.
Dean, finally.
We asked at the beginning if we were gloomy or optimistic, pessimistic, and I've seen it firsthand, and it has got worse, but I am optimistic. And I think there is a real momentum of change, and there's a lot of people wanting to know how they can help facilitate that change. And 2021 we start the International Decade of Ocean Science. So what I learned from the last project I did was that raw data can't be ignored, and actually it has a huge amount of value. So this is going to be the decade of change where we're going to make it all happen. And actually the power is with the consumer, it's with us, with everyday people. And if we haven't seen that from that Swedish girl about climate change and the kids missing school, the power that had and the momentum it created on a global scale from an 11-year-old or whatever, then I think we underestimate what we can do. And these guys can have the pressure applied. If we as a consumer demand change and demand difference and ask them to be accountable, we have a massive power, and I think we underestimate that sometimes. So I'm positive.
Thank you very much. Two strands of summing up. One is what we would do now on the basis of what everybody's said. Were we to write a newspaper leader, which we actually call a take, and we're going to publish one on a separate subject for the first time tomorrow. And we started with the question, can we save the seas? And in a word, the answer has to be yes, because they cover 70% of the planet, and if we can't, we are screwed. Sasha, I think a lot of us agree with you and James that if we're not careful, and Frank, the problem is as large as the oceans and defeats us. But we've seen, thank you, Matthew, Walker Crisps, and other specific cases. I mean, the whole issue of plastic as a handle with which to grasp the bigger problem, that there are points of access which give us hope, and one that we haven't talked about as much as I'd hoped, but we can do that in Brighton, and everybody's welcome to come to the next ThinkIn, is marine protected areas, because the rate at which we've expanded them, largely by making tremendous use of otherwise, frankly, useless British overseas territories, is amazing. And let's at least give Gove credit for that, yeah? But then there's the question of how you police these vast areas, and is the tech up for it? But I think all those strands and pressure points give me at least the confidence that if I were asked to write a piece of opinion on that, we'd say yes, we can save the seas. And it's not just dependent on political will. I mean, individuals, Dee, and you, Frederica, and you, Chris, have all shown that you can set your own pace. You don't necessarily have to follow that set by governments. Though I have to say, with the case of the Asian rivers, it seems to me that we're not going to get very far unless we get the Chinese environment minister on side. James, you were making the point earlier that they're actually pretty good at what they do, but we come back to the tragedy of the commons, that insofar as that particular problem is sluicing out to sea, it may not be as important to them as the air quality in Beijing or Shanghai. As to specific subjects that we should be reporting on, well, I mean, where do we start? Overfishing. There are some tremendous stories actually of recovery there, aren't there? as well as depletion. I'd like to actually be sent on assignment to Barney. Help me out. What's the name?
Barney, Ajarampat.
Yes.
I think Barney gets to go.
Oh, okay.
You don't get to go.
Oh, all right, all right. And am I not allowed to assign myself? And Bex, the whole question of not being able to recycle our way out of this, and the imperative to use less. It is an intangible subject, but we have to get our heads around it somehow. As I say, to be continued. Thank you all very much for coming. And if you want to stick around and collar people, now's your chance. Thanks very much.